I want to begin before we go into our conversation here on this Free to Choose Friday focused in the problem of poverty in America today by playing one more clip of Milton Friedman. And this, again, is cut 2. And this really resonates with the last 2 conversations. We played this at the beginning of the show. I think it's worth hearing again, where Dr. Friedman talked about the free market being a positive with government being much more of a negative.
So far as poverty is concerned, there has never in history been a more effective machine for eliminating poverty than the free enterprise system and the free market. The period in which you had the greatest improvement in the lot of the ordinary man was the period of the 19th and early 20th century. Those of us in this room are the heirs of that. We benefited from the way in which our parents and our grandparents were able to come here. And by virtue of the freedom that was offered to them, were able to make a better life for themselves and them and us. But next, if you look at the real problems of poverty and denial of freedom to people in this country, almost every single one of them is a result of government action and would be eliminated if you eliminated the bad government failures. Let me be precise and specific. We have constructed a governmental welfare scheme which has been a machine for producing poor people. We have induced people to come under control of welfare. I'm not blaming the people, don't misunderstand me. It's our fault for constructing so perverse and so ill-shaped a monster as the whole set of welfare programs we have, under which we encourage people, families to break up. We encourage people to move from one part of the country and come to another, under which we have, in effect, made many people poor.
Always great wisdom from Milton Friedman, noted free market economist, here on a Free to Choose Friday. And such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. We're working right now on getting one of our guests on the line, who is Michael D. Tanner from the Cato Institute, a senior fellow. We're going to be phone calling him today. But I am pleased to welcome first up on the show, since we've got him on video, Scott Santens joins us here. He is on the board for the Fund for Humanity and is a leading advocate for universal basic income, and he joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Scott, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Hi, Jimmy. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks for coming on. So while Nathan cues up Michael Tanner, I want to ask you sort of your perspective overall on the problem of poverty and the challenge and difficulty in America today, both leading up to the crisis that we're facing right now and now that we're seeing economic malaise in all corners of the country.
Okay. We're just talking about the problem of poverty. I think it's good to listen to what Milton Friedman has to say. But I also like to suggest, too, that, and he knew this, but poverty is an issue of not having enough money. And so if we want to solve people not having enough money, it makes the most sense to just make sure people have money. And if we did that without all the bureaucracy involved that we seem to insist on doing, and what Milton Friedman was against, just saying, look, if people don't have money, then just make sure that we provide it to them. And let's basically go around government having their decisions and limitations that are imposed on people as to how that money can be used. I think a good example, too, is just to look at Alaska, because Alaska really is the closest example in the world to a functioning universal basic income. And it has been in place since 1982, where everyone has received this dividend. And the way that they think about it, aside from being a dividend, is they think of it as a form of pre-distribution. So it's not redistribution. It's saying that we have this money, and instead of letting the government decide what to do with it, let's just make sure that it goes directly to the people and they can decide for themselves what to do with it. And I think that is the direct elimination of poverty is the way to go. And especially right now, and we're seeing essentially it's not a failure of markets, it's a failure of consumption power, where people are lining up in food banks, and at the same time there's plenty of food in stores that people aren't able to buy. And meanwhile, farmers are actually plowing their crops under the ground. And the way to fix this is just to make sure people can actually use money to spend in markets on these goods and services.
So let me ask you a question, since you brought up Milton Friedman. I mean, Milton Friedman absolutely agreed with the premise that we shouldn't have this massive welfare state. He was a supporter of what's called the negative income tax, so not quite a universal basic income, but it would work in a similar way, just in a more narrowly tailored context. What are your thoughts on sort of his approach to poverty and to addressing this kind of situation, from both the let's eliminate the welfare state and replace it, and the let's make it more narrowly tailored and not for just everybody?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't know that Milton Friedman was actually asked about universal basic income and in comparison to negative income tax. And he referred to it as two ways of doing the same thing. And that's a good understanding too, because even though universal basic income goes to everybody, there are still net payers and net receivers, just like in a negative income tax system. So the way to kind of differentiate between the two is that, let's say at a threshold point where a negative income tax, someone would receive $0. In a universal basic income system, someone would pay $12,000 to receive $12,000. So they're no better off or worse off, and that's based on their income. And I would argue that I think he would actually agree with the UBI model now, because the labor market has transformed so much since Milton's time. Like at the time, you would get a job and it would be a career and it would be something that you could keep for years or even decades. And your monthly income was actually very stable. So it would actually be pretty easy to calculate what your negative income tax would be based on that monthly income if you were going to make sure that everyone received a monthly negative income tax. But with the increased variance in monthly income, it actually makes it more and more difficult to figure out how to calculate that. And there's an efficiency loss. Like does it make sense to calculate on both the front end and figure out what a payment should be each and every month based on the bureaucracy involved, reporting what your income is to the government, to figure out what the amount should be? Or does it make sense to just make sure everyone gets that $1,000 and then calculate on the back end via the tax code what your taxes should be based on that?
Scott Santens, let's talk for a moment about the idea of a UBI as you're proposing, in addition to the existing welfare state or in replacement to it, because, and we'll talk about expense and those kinds of things coming up, but in my mind, what I look at is if we're going to do any sort of a system like this, and I have been more favorable towards a negative income tax system than a UBI, I think that you need to do it as a replacement of the existing welfare state and not as a supplement, because I think that we need to be addressing disincentives to work and a variety of things. And if you combine the two, then that provides an even greater disincentive to work. And then also there are role of government questions as well. But what do you make of the additional component, the supplement, or instead of replacement?
Yeah, I like to stress that UBI is a proposed foundation. And so once you have that foundation, then we need to look at what we're doing right now without a foundation. So in which case, it makes sense to figure out which programs are we doing that no longer make sense at all, that we should eliminate, which programs actually should continue to exist, but to a smaller degree potentially on top of basic income, and which programs actually make sense to actually keep on top of basic income. And I think that's a debate to be had to figure out which is which. But I think that there are a lot of programs that don't make any sense. And I also think that, right now we already decide that someone no longer, let's say, qualifies for food stamps if they're earning, $1,000 per month more than what they are right now. Mm-hmm. So in which case, if they start receiving $1,000 per month of basic income, then they should no longer qualify for those under the existing conditions.
Sure. Scott Santens joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. He is board member for the Fund for Humanity and one of the leading advocates for universal basic income. And we are, I believe, now joined by Michael D. Tanner, senior fellow at the Cato Institute. We're just dealing with, sometimes you have some technical issues on a Free to Choose Friday. Michael Tanner, can you hear me, sir?
I can now, loud and clear.
Good. I love it. So you can't see this, but in the last segment, put me up on the screen, full screen for a second, Nathan Matoush. In the last segment, we had Dr. Walter E. Williams, who was the earliest free market influence on me. When I was in high school, I was listening to him on talk radio back in the mid-2000s. And in 2007, I went to a high school conference in Washington, D.C., Lead America, and there was a speaker named Michael D. Tanner who came and spoke about healthcare reform. And he brought copies of a book called Leviathan on the Right, which I have right here in my hand, that also is autographed by Michael Tanner, who was another early influence on yours truly on free market economics. So once again, it is a pleasure to have you on the show, sir. Welcome.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I do remember those lead conferences. They were terrific.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So I want to focus on you for a few minutes here, Michael D. Tanner, since we've been getting a lot of perspective from Scott Santens, particularly on the question of universal basic income. And let me just throw at you a first question, then we'll get your thoughts on UBI, which is the problem of poverty in America today. How do you assess where we are at, or sort of where we were at pre-pandemic and then during the pandemic now?
Well, pre-pandemic, I think that we had achieved some success at reducing material poverty. That is, there were relatively few people in the United States that are starving to death. We're not the South Sudan. That if you look at material levels of poverty, count in all the welfare benefits that we provide, we spend about $120 billion a year on over 100 different federal welfare programs. I'm sorry, about $1.2 trillion a year on over 100 anti-poverty programs. And we have reduced material poverty, but we have not done a very good job of enabling people to get out of poverty permanently, to become masters of their own destiny, to be able to rise as far as their talents will take them. We have not done a very good job of ending poverty. What we've done is do a pretty good job of making poverty more tolerable.
And so with that in mind, I mean, there are a lot of different ways to go about addressing this issue. We've seen the war on poverty since 1968 focused on a slew of different welfare programs. We have well over 100 different anti-poverty programs, and clearly it seems to me, and I think to you from your research, that it hasn't worked out so well. So one of the solutions that has been put forward, and Scott is a strong advocate for this, is the universal basic income. What do you make of it, big picture, Michael Tanner?
Well, count me as a sympathetic skeptic when it comes to the universal basic income. I think there is a strong theoretical argument behind it. It would be certainly more transparent. It would be less bureaucratic. It makes more sense than having 100 and some odd different programs, all with their own different rules and eligibility levels. It treats poor people like adults, giving them cash and letting them take care of themselves with it. And it does deal with some of the disincentives that are built into the current system for work and marriage. That said, trying to do it simply across the board universally would be impossibly expensive. It would cost between $2.5 and $3 trillion a year, which is almost our current federal budget at a time when we don't have very much money because we're spending lots of money fighting this pandemic and its various problems. We're running up our deficit ever deeper. The only way to be able to fund something like this would be an enormous increase in taxes, which would reduce the availability of wealth in this country. You can't ultimately redistribute something that doesn't exist. If you raise taxes so high that you destroy entrepreneurship and the ability to produce wealth, you're not going to be able to fund a UBI.
Let me ask one more question of you, Michael Tanner, and then we'll get to Scott Santens. When you look at the idea of UBI, there are two theories on how to go about this. One is a wholesale replacement. If you did a UBI, or maybe we also talked a little bit about a negative income tax, one of these minimum income type policies, would that be in addition to the existing welfare state or a wholesale replacement of the welfare state as we have it today? What do you think it would need to be if we were to try some sort of a UBI? What are your thoughts on that question?
Well, I think it would have to be a replacement for the existing welfare state. For one thing, it's partially in the funding. I'd say about $1.2 trillion that we have in the existing programs. Certainly, that would go a long way towards helping to fund any UBI program. And the second is that you simply don't want to take all the problems that exist in the existing welfare system and simply cover them over with a UBI. What you're trying to do is do away with those problems and come up with a better system, not simply create an additional system on top of the bad one.
Michael D. Tanner joining us from the Cato Institute, senior fellow there, as well as Scott Santens, a leading advocate for universal basic income and on the board for the Fund for Humanity. All right, Scott, I'll just let you go ahead and share some thoughts on what Michael just said.
Okay, yeah. Just first of all, hey, Mike, it's good to talk to you again. It's been a while. It's been a couple of years. But yeah, I just want to say that yeah, he's right as far as pointing out the existing expenditures of welfare, how expensive that is, and how it makes sense to replace it. And I just also want to point out too that we also have a lot of welfare essentially in the tax code, and we don't call it that. We do $1.5 trillion of tax expenditures every year, and actually 17% of those tax expenditures go to the top 1%. And I think it makes sense as not only welfare reform in order to reduce the total revenue requirements for a basic income, but also tax reform. There's just a lot of subsidies and deductions and everything else we could eliminate as part of this program as well. And I also think it's important to recognize that we are spending a lot of money not having basic economic security. And that's in the form of poverty, and that's in the form of crime. Child poverty alone costs over $1 trillion a year. There's an estimate of crime being over $1 trillion a year as well. So it's important to recognize that if we do spend money up front to actually have a firm foundation underneath us, then there's a lot of money that we would no longer spend on a lot of these other things that we are spending a lot of money on downstream instead of upstream. And I also think that's important too, that it would enable so much more entrepreneurship than is possible now by reducing risk aversion. So many more people could actually go into business, and those businesses could succeed because they would have customers. And I think that's really important to recognize right now is there's a serious problem of lack of customers. Like if you open a restaurant right now, great, who's going to go there? How can they afford to go there? If we make sure that people have money to spend in these, then that would actually be great for business and it would be great for the economy.
Michael D. Tanner, how about Scott's argument about how, if we were to spend money, $3 trillion, $4 trillion, whatever the amount is, on a universal basic income on an annual basis, we would actually find a heck of a lot of cost savings in other areas and also boost demand, aggregate demand for new products and services that can then help create jobs and opportunity?
Yeah, on the first side, he's absolutely correct. I think that there would be some savings, whether there be sufficient savings to do this to offset the entire additional cost. I can't possibly see that. But there would certainly be some savings in other areas. Although we should be aware, we've been told so many times this program, for every dollar you spend, we save $6 or $7. We should be, we should be cash free by now with all the savings we've earned from all those programs that saved us money. That's the other side of that is in the demand increases. I'm simply not a Keynesian. I ultimately believe that demand simply moves money from one person to, spending moves money from one person to another. Exactly. So person A spends it instead of person B, but it doesn't create new wealth in society. You get new wealth out of investment and entrepreneurial activity. And what we actually need is people to create more new things, new products, new services that didn't exist before. And that ultimately, that comes from a different type of use of the money than simply demand-based spending.
On that point, I wholeheartedly agree, and I'll just say, but I'll get to you right in 1 second. I just want to make one observation that I had Mark Cuban on yesterday, and we were debating his idea for a federal jobs program, and that was one point I was touching on a little bit. And so, Scott, I am curious your thoughts on that, because I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're headed into what could essentially be a second Great Depression. I mean, there really could be a serious, permanent loss of jobs. I mean, I've seen a recent estimate was that 42% of the jobs that I've eliminated are not going to come back. That for every 10 people who have lost their jobs, 3 can be rehired. Like, we could be looking at a lot of unemployment. And I mean, if we looked at the Great Depression, we had all the resources, we had the technology, we had the people, and yet it was all just sitting there essentially. And so this kind of demand versus supply thing, I think we have to come back and realize that, especially right now, we have the ability to produce these things. It's just people don't have the money. And I think that if we make sure people have the money, then that'll kickstart this and we can start going forward. And without that, we're going to be in a world of hurt. And as for just a quick thing on a job guarantee, I'm not a fan of that approach. I think that, as Milton Friedman himself said, when looking at a work site that had a bunch of construction workers and stuff there, and talking about like the jobs, and he said, well, if your jobs are the gold, then why don't you give these people spoons instead of shovels?
Exactly.
And I think he had a great point there, where our goal as a society should be, okay, what do we want to get done? What do we need to get done? And I think utilizing automation makes a whole lot more sense. And I think that as we get more and more productive, we should actually continue to be able to work less. Like we should actually, if we're twice as productive, why are we working 40-hour weeks when we could be working 20-hour weeks? Like we should have more choice into what we're doing. And we want to enable people to do the jobs that are the best fit for them, be it becoming an entrepreneur or finding the right fit for them in the market, and not saying, well, these people are unemployed, let's just create something and basically force them into it because they need it in order to survive.
In a moment, I want to get to the cost question of how you would afford this, what would be done, the mechanisms. But Michael D. Tanner, first, I'd love for you to respond. There was a lot there that Scott had to say.
And unfortunately, due to the technical problems, I can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't hear Scott. Okay, so
I can hear you, but I can't hear him.
Oh, okay. Well, you should have let me know about that. I was wondering before when they're talking with Nathan. So I'm so sorry about that. You can't. I don't know what's going on with you, Michael. You're not helping us out today. So in essence, one of the things that he was pointing out in terms of, say, a jobs program, he mentioned, I think, spot on about the Milton Friedman comment about spoons. If you give people spoons, then you can create a whole slew of jobs. And so instead, what you're doing with the universal basic income, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding what you were saying, Scott, and then I'll relay that to Michael, but is that you still have those market mechanisms in place where the jobs will be created in the private sector, and you will not have some sort of a government job creation scheme that could lead to permanency in that regard. Instead, you still have those economic incentives in play and so forth, those dynamics just supported by a basic income to everybody. Am I right, Scott, first of all? Is that a good
Yeah, that's correct.
He says that's right.
Yeah, he's actually, he's right in that, to the degree that you're not essentially creating jobs that serve no purpose, but you're not actually creating jobs at all. What you're essentially doing is subsidizing individuals at a certain level of income. And the problem with that is that that there is no new creation in there. There's no new job creation in there that comes from investment. What you need to do is actually have people who are willing to take risks, and those risks have to have a certain return to capital, and that's ultimately what's going to create something new out there. You can't simply move money around from person A to person B. You can go back to Bastiat's broken window fallacy, where the boy throws a rock through the window of the restaurant, and then the restaurateur has to pay a glazier to fix the window, and then the glazier can eat at the restaurateur's restaurant. None of that creates any new wealth in society. So I don't think you can simply tax away investment opportunities from the rich and say, we'll give that money to everybody in the universal basic income, and that's going to create any new growth or any new wealth in society.
Well, let me just say that I was talking with Nathan Matoush, my producer extraordinaire, and that what may be going on is just we've never tried a Skype and vMix call conversation, and so it apparently is not mixing quite as well. But I think you're so spot on, Michael D. Tanner. In fact, I showed the broken window theory. We read a part of that which is seen, that which is not seen the other day, and I put that exact passage up on the screen because we do talk about Bastiat here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. So, Scott, just a few minutes left with you guys, and Scott, I wonder if you could talk with us a little bit about the spending question. How would you go about financing a UBI? Because it would be a multi-trillion-dollar program each year.
Yeah. So first of all, again, like with Michael said, as far as the cost, and this is a common, say, misunderstanding of UBI and negative income taxes, that they essentially cost widely varying or different amounts. Whereas if you have a negative income tax with a 50% clawback rate, then that could be identically designed to a UBI with a 50% flat tax, and the net cost of both would be the same. So if you can look at a negative income tax and say it's affordable, then so is a UBI. It just depends on how you do the clawback. And I think that it makes sense. I like how Andrew Yang ran on a value-added tax. That would be essentially a 10% clawback, but via your consumption patterns. And so that's essentially a negative consumption tax. It's basically saying that if you are spending a lot of money, then you are a net payer into the system. And if you're not spending a lot of money, then you're a net receiver into the system.
Yeah, go ahead and explain that a little bit more, please. The clawback 10% and how that would function from the Yang's proposal.
Yeah, so Yang's proposal with a 10% value-added tax. Let's say you are earning, or let's say you're spending $120,000 per year, and let's say all those goods and services have the 10% VAT. And let's also assume that the entire VAT is passed on to consumers, even though that's not really a realistic assumption, but for matters of simplicity. So if you're spending $120,000 with a 10% VAT, then you're essentially spending $12,000 into the VAT system. And with your $1,000 per month freedom dividend, you'd be receiving that in addition. And so then you would essentially be receiving $0 because you'd be essentially paying for your own basic income. And so everyone spending more than $120,000 into the system is actually paying for their own basic income. And in which case that carries no actual cost. It's just kind of, a cost on paper, but not really an actual cost to society.
Michael D. Tanner, I know you're familiar with Andrew Yang's proposal and the idea of a 10% value-added tax, which he just explained. Talk to us your thoughts on the financing potentially.
Yeah, the couple of problems with that approach is, one is what you do is recreate some of the disincentives towards work that exists in the existing system. Because if you are going to earn more and spend more, you're going to get a smaller. Ultimately, as you just point out, you get zero. So basically, what you're going to do is, I think, create more disincentives and then sort of recreate some of the disincentives that exist with the existing system. One of the advantages of the UBI as opposed to a negative income tax approach to it is that you essentially have an absolute floor that everybody gets, and there's no disincentive to earn if you earn over and above that. As soon as you start building in any sort of recapture mechanism, you begin to dilute that incentive towards work that you currently have. The other problem simply with the value-added tax is it's an invisible tax in effect. It's very different from, say, a retail sales tax or the fair tax proposal or any of those sorts of things. It's an invisible tax at every layer of production, and it does tend to create problems along the way that they found primarily in Europe. It ends up to be highly regressive. It ends up to be an encouragement for the government to simply spend money because the public's not aware of where the taxes burden is falling, and it does tend to create problems at different levels of creation or different levels of production along the way.
Michael D. Tanner, just one quick follow-up here. Since you mentioned a negative income tax, we've talked about that a couple of different times. Could you just give in a nutshell what an NIT would do as opposed to a UBI?
Sure. Well, an NIT is essentially the only difference between them is the UBI is essentially universal, whereas negative income tax essentially says that once you reach a certain level of income, you start paying it back. Now, Scott's right in the fact that if you're going to impose a tax on people and you count all this as wealth, it all comes out to be roughly the same thing, depending on where you impose your various taxes at any level. Whether or not if somebody gets a basic, if somebody's paying a 50% tax rate and they get a $12,000 basic income, at that point they're going to pay $6,000 in taxes. You don't need to have set up a specific negative income tax level. but you're going to basically they're going to end up paying back a lot of their UBI. So it's not truly universal. It is essentially a means tested program, just using the tax system as the means testing mechanism.
So, Michael, were you able to hear some of what Scott said before?
I was not.
Okay, I was just wanted to double check on that for a second, because how you framed it, I know you're familiar with this line of thinking there. I wasn't sure if something Nathan had tried had worked or not. So thank you guys for your patience here. Scott, a quick response, and then I have one more question for Michael. Just anything that Michael was saying, any additional points that you want to make, because I know you guys I really appreciate you sticking along with us a little longer than anticipated, so thank you.
Yeah, I just want to point out that I think there is a kind of a different incentive mechanism with a consumption tax that is indirect versus a direct kind of tax on income. And so people can just kind of imagine this too, how this would work, where you can see a disincentive if like your tax rate goes up if you say earn more money. And so maybe you wouldn't say accept that raise or something like that, because you're like, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to lose more money from taxes anyways. But if it's through like consumption, let's say you want to buy an Xbox and the price of the Xbox goes up 10%. Like, are you going to work less because the price went up, or are you potentially going to work more because you want to afford that cost? And so I think that there is a difference in motivation between different ways of taxation. And that's why I think that a consumption tax like a value-added tax makes more sense. And also, in Europe and stuff, there's a consumption tax is regressive, but we're talking about a revenue-neutral value-added tax. So the money is going right back to people. It's not going to government. And then so therefore people are actually having a net increase in spending power, not a net decrease unless you're at the very top. And just one thing too I want to mention just from previous, I just want to point out that when it comes to like a job guarantee, a lot of this is just the way that we look at work. So when you're saying like, let's make sure a single mother at home has a job. And so then let's guarantee that she can work in childcare. Well, what is the difference? Like if you're a parent and you're doing unpaid care work at home, then we're just not recognizing that work as work. If two people start watching each other's kids and then they're getting a job guarantee to do it, then we can say that those are jobs, but is that better work that's being done? Is there more work being done? Like, let's actually recognize all the unpaid work in society going on, and let's enable people to actually do that work, and let's recognize it. And basic income does that, which is another reason I think it's so important.
Michael D. Tanner, one thing that was striking about what Scott Santens was just saying was about how if you go ahead and do a jobs program, say a federal jobs guarantee or something like what Mark Cuban has been suggesting, and we debated yesterday here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, then what you might do is pull parents away from the home for something that might not actually be more productive than, say, home child care. Whereas if you go ahead and do something like a UBI, then that means that a parent's going to be able to stay home and make good use of their time, perhaps if they feel that it's needed in order to do child care and take care of those sort of home responsibilities that maybe our current economic system doesn't value in the way that we should, because under the way things are right now, economically speaking, if you are at home and not working, then you're not being productive and not earning an income, at least in an economic context, but you are doing something at home.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and that is one of the advantages of a UBI is that it tends to value non-traditional work in ways that traditional social welfare programs do not, or traditional jobs for that matter. On the other hand, we also suffer a problem in our society of too small a workforce. One of the reasons that GDP is not as high as it otherwise would be is not just a crisis of productivity, but the fact that we have too small a labor force. Now, we could obviously increase immigration, which I think would be great, but that doesn't seem to be on the immediate horizon. We actually need people to go into the labor force, so encouraging them to stay home is probably counterproductive at this point.
And Michael Tanner, final question for you, and then we'll cut you guys loose again. I appreciate your time today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. All right, so you're a sympathetic skeptic as far as UBI is concerned. Scott Santens is all in. I'm someone who's been more favorable towards a negative income tax as a wholesale replacement for the current welfare system. What do you think we should do or should be looking at from your standpoint?
Well, I think we should begin to take steps in the direction of a UBI or negative income tax, in the sense that we should be moving to cash rather than in-kind benefits. Instead of paying landlords and doctors and grocery stores, we should be paying poor people and letting them handle their own money. And we should be consolidating the hundreds of some odd programs into a single program. So we should begin moving in that direction, but at this point we can't afford to go whole hog.
I think that what we're getting at here as well, we may have disagreements on the way in which to go about this. We all agree fundamentally that letting people be free to choose how to spend money their own way seems to be superior to a lot of the micromanaged systems that we've got right now in our current welfare system. Would you both agree with that?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. You both said the word absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you so much. We'll have to do this again where we can make it function very well. Get Michael on the screen, too. But Scott Santens on the board for Fund for Humanity, and Michael D. Tanner, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. Thank you both so much for joining us today here on Free to Choose Friday on Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, gentlemen. Once again, Michael D. Tanner of the Cato Institute, Scott Santens, who's on the board for Fund for Humanity, both joining us here on the show. And it's always great when you get thoughtful people who can have a great discussion and conversation. And that's what we like to do here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.